In the annals of the American West, few tales inspire more awe than that of Sheriff Marcus "Iron Hand" Callahan, a man whose weathered badge concealed a legend that would make even the most ruthless outlaws tremble. They say when the notorious Black River Gang threatened to burn his town to the ground, they had no idea they were challenging the very man who had single-handedly dismantled the deadliest outlaw confederation in Texas history. Some men wear a badge to uphold the law, others wear it to hide their demons. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Shadow Creek, Arizona Territory, 1875, stood as a testament to humanity's determination to carve civilization from wilderness. The town had grown from a humble silver mining outpost into a promising settlement, its neat rows of wooden buildings and wide streets speaking to the ordered vision of its residents. But it was the man who kept that order who truly set Shadow Creek apart, Sheriff Marcus Callahan, whose silver hair and lined face belied a vigor that younger men had learned to respect. To most residents, Callahan was simply the old man, a steady presence who had served as their sheriff for the past 5 years. They knew him as deliberate in movement and sparse with words, a man who preferred to settle disputes with stern wisdom rather than steel. His most distinguishing features were the leather glove he always wore on his right hand, supposedly covering burns from a tragic house fire, and the immaculately maintained Colt peacemaker that rode low on his hip in a well-oiled holster. Dr. Sarah Wheeler, who treated the sheriff's occasional bouts of rheumatism, saw glimpses of something more beneath his carefully maintained facade. The scars that mapped his body told a story at odds with his quiet demeanor. Precise knife wounds, bullet marks that spoke of close-quarter fighting, the kind of history that made her wonder about the weight behind his steady gaze. "There's a difference between men who've learned to shoot and men who've learned to kill," she once confided to her friend Emma Parker, the owner of the town's general store. "The sheriff's eyes, they remind me of the veteran gunfighters I treated during the war. There's a weight there, a burden that comes from seeing too much." The sheriff's daily routine was as regular as the town clock. He made his rounds at dawn and dusk, took his meals at Emma's cafe, and spent his evenings on the porch of the jail, whittling wood with his left hand while watching the street with eyes that missed nothing. His deputy, young Thomas Reed, often remarked how the sheriff could spot trouble brewing before anyone else, as if he had a sixth sense for violence. The town's children viewed him with a mixture of awe and affection. He always had time to help a lost child or offer a piece of hard candy from the jar on his desk. But even they sensed something different about him, especially in the way he moved, quiet as a mountain cat, despite his age. Their parents noticed, too, how he could appear seemingly out of nowhere when trouble threatened, his mere presence often enough to diffuse tense situations. Callahan's reputation for fairness and steady judgment had helped Shadow Creek prosper. The silver mine's payroll moved through town without incident, cattle drives passed peacefully, and even the roughest elements seemed to respect the boundaries he set. View connected this peace to the subtle signs, how drifters with hard eyes and gunfighters' calluses would quickly move on after a quiet word with the sheriff, or how traveling lawmen would straighten with recognition when they heard his name. The truth about Marcus Callahan lay buried in scattered whispers and yellowing wanted posters, in campfire tales of a legendary Texas Ranger whose skill with a gun was matched only by his ruthless efficiency in hunting down those who prey on the innocent. They spoke of a man called Iron Hand Callahan, who had spent 15 years pursuing the most dangerous outlaws across the territories, his name alone enough to make hardened killers choose different hunting grounds. But that was all in the past, or so the people of Shadow Creek believed. Their sheriff was just a weathered old lawman, content to end his days keeping peace in a growing town. This illusion of tranquility was about to be shattered by the arrival of the Black River Gang, a brutal collection of killers whose latest spree of bank robberies and murder had the entire territory on edge. As autumn painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Shadow Creek was about to discover that fate had given them more than just a sheriff. It had given them a guardian whose quiet demeanor masked a deadly skill that had never truly faded. The legend of Iron Hand was about to rise again, and the Black River Gang would learn why some reputations are earned in blood. In the saloon, where tongues loosened by whiskey often spoke truth, old Jim Morrison, who'd ridden with the Texas Rangers in his youth, would sometimes get a distant look in his eyes when asked about the sheriff. "Some men," he'd say, staring into his glass, "they're like iron that's been folded and hammered 1,000 times. Looks plain on the surface, but there's patterns underneath that only show when the light hits them just right. Our sheriff, he's got layers most folks never see. Pray you never have to." The stage was set for a confrontation that would strip away pretense and reveal the deadly truth behind the badge. Shadow Creek was about to learn that some men don't age. They just get more dangerous with time. The first signs of trouble arrived with the evening stage, carried in the haunted eyes of a young banker from Willow Springs. Sheriff Callahan was making his evening rounds when the coach thundered into town, its horses lathered and blowing hard, the driver pushing them well beyond their usual pace. The banker, Augustus Webb, practically fell from the coach, his fine suit covered in dust and his face ashen with terror. Within minutes, Callahan had him settled in his office, a cup of strong coffee warming his trembling hands. The story spilled out between shaky sips. The Black River Gang had struck again, this time hitting the Willow Springs Bank in broad daylight. But it wasn't just the robbery that had Webb rattled, it was the calculated brutality of their methods. "They didn't just take the money," Webb explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "They made examples, shot the security guard in the legs, made him crawl. Their leader, Jackson Black, he said it was a message, said every town from here to the Colorado would learn to fear that name." The banker's hands shook, sloshing coffee onto his sleeve. "They're not just outlaws, Sheriff. They're butchers." Deputy Reed, listening from his desk, saw something change in the sheriff's expression, subtle, like the first shadow of a storm cloud passing over the sun. Callahan's questions came measured and precise, each one drawing out specific details about the gang's tactics, their weapons, their patterns of movement. These weren't the usual queries of a small-town lawman. They were the calculated probings of a hunter studying his prey. Dr. Wheeler, arriving to check on the banker's condition, caught the tail end of the conversation. She noticed how the sheriff's gloved right hand kept brushing the worn grip of his peacemaker, an unconscious gesture that spoke of ingrained habits. More telling was how he stood, no longer the slightly stooped posture of an aging lawman, but the balanced stance of a man ready for violence. Later that evening, Emma Parker's cafe became the center of town speculation. News of the Willow Springs robbery spread quickly, carried on whispers of fear and speculation. The details grew with each retelling, how the Black River Gang had grown to over 20 hardened killers, how they left a trail of burning buildings and broken families across 3 territories, how even the territorial marshals hesitated to pursue them. "They say Jackson Black used to ride with Quantrill's raiders during the war," Jim Morrison shared over coffee, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Learned his trade killing civilians, and he's only gotten worse since." The old ex-ranger's eyes drifted to where Sheriff Callahan sat at his usual table, seemingly absorbed in his evening meal. "Might be time to send for help, Sheriff. No shame in admitting when trouble's too big for one man." Callahan's response was characteristic in its brevity. "Town's got a sheriff. That's help enough." "Daddy," but there was something in his tone that made Morrison study him more closely, a hint of steel that reminded him of other men he'd known, men whose quiet words carried deadly promise. As night settled over Shadow Creek, more details emerged about the Black River Gang's pattern. They'd hit 4 towns in the past month, each robbery more violent than the last. Their gang had grown, attracting the worst elements from across the territories, deserters, murderers, and hired guns drawn by Jackson Black's growing reputation for successful brutality. In his office, Callahan spent the evening reviewing wanted posters by lamplight, his gloved hand tracing the paths of reported sightings on a territorial map. Deputy Reed, watching his mentor work, noticed how the sheriff lingered over one particular poster, a sketch of Jackson Black himself, with a list of known aliases beneath it. Something in the sheriff's scrutiny suggested more than professional interest. "You ever run into any of Black's crew before?" Reed ventured to ask. The question hung in the air for a long moment before Callahan responded, his voice carrying an edge the deputy had never heard before. "Long time ago," the sheriff said quietly, "back in Texas, before he called himself Black, back when he rode with a man named Marcus Hayes." The name seemed to carry special weight, though Reed didn't recognize it. Hayes taught him everything he knows about causing pain, taught him too well. The deputy wanted to ask more, but something in Callahan's expression warned against it. Instead, he watched as the sheriff stood and walked to the gun rack, removing a well-oiled Winchester rifle. With methodical precision, Callahan began to clean the weapon, his movements speaking of years of practice. The leather glove came off for this task, and in the lamplight, Reed caught a glimpse of what it usually hid, not burn scars as rumored, but a web of old knife wounds cross-hatching the skin. Out in the gathering darkness, Shadow Creek settled in for what many feared might be its last peaceful night. Unknown to them, their aging sheriff was preparing for a confrontation that would shake their understanding of the quiet man who had guarded their peace for 5 years. The badge he wore had kept his past hidden, but soon it would serve as a target for men who didn't realize they were challenging a legend they thought long dead. As Callahan finished with the rifle and reached for his pistol, the lamplight caught his reflection in the office window. For a moment, Deputy Reed saw what others would soon discover, not the aged lawman of Shadow Creek, but the deadly specter of Iron Hand Callahan, the man who had brought justice to the darkest corners of the frontier, one bullet at a time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn painted Shadow Creek in shades of amber and gold, but Sheriff Callahan had been awake long before the sun crested the eastern mountains. He stood on the jail's porch, watching the town come to life, while his mind worked through the calculations of survival. 20 years of experience had taught him to read the signs others missed, and everything pointed to trouble riding toward Shadow Creek like an approaching storm. Dr. Wheeler, making her early morning rounds, paused at the sight of the sheriff's silhouette against the rising sun. Something had changed in his bearing overnight. The careful stoop of age had vanished, replaced by the straight-backed vigilance of a predator scenting danger. When he turned to acknowledge her presence, she noticed his eyes constantly scanning the street, cataloguing every movement with military precision. "Expecting trouble, Sheriff?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. His response was characteristic in its brevity, but heavy with meaning. "Trouble's already here, Doc, just waiting on it to show itself." He flexed his gloved right hand. A gesture she'd noticed became more frequent when violence loomed on the horizon. Throughout the morning, Callahan moved through town with deliberate purpose. He visited the livery stable, ensuring fresh horses were ready. He spoke with Emma Parker about stockpiling supplies in her cellar. He had Deputy Reed inventory their ammunition and send telegrams to neighboring towns. Each action was measured, methodical, the movements of a man who had orchestrated such preparations many times before. The changes didn't go unnoticed. Jim Morrison, watching from his usual spot outside the saloon, recognized the pattern. He'd seen it before in the war, the way veteran commanders prepared their positions before a battle. "You see how he's setting up fields of fire?" he murmured to Thomas Reed. Marking distances, noting cover, that ain't standard sheriff work. That's tactical thinking. By midday, 3 strangers had ridden into town, dusty men with hard eyes and well-worn gun belts. They claimed to be cattle buyers, but Callahan noted how they separated upon arrival, each taking up positions that offered clear views of the main street. He watched them through his office window, his gloved hand resting near his peacemaker. "Scouts," he explained to Reed, his voice pitched low. "Black's men, testing our defenses, counting guns, noting routines." He paused, studying how the strangers interacted with townspeople. "They'll report back that we're an easy target. 1 aging sheriff, 1 green deputy. That's exactly what we want them to think." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Shouldn't we arrest them? Run them out of town at least?" Callahan's response carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Sometimes the trap works better if you let them think they're the ones setting it." As afternoon shadows lengthened, more subtle changes manifested in Shadow Creek. Augustus Webb, still shaken from his experience in Willow Springs, noticed how the sheriff had quietly organized the townspeople. Store owners began moving valuables to secure locations. Emma Parker's usual dinner crowd found themselves seated away from windows. Even the children seemed to pick up on the tension, staying closer to home than usual. But it was Dr. Wheeler who witnessed the most telling transformation. Called to the jail to treat a prisoner's injured hand, she arrived to find Callahan practicing with his peacemaker in the back lot. His movements were a revelation, lightning-fast draws, followed by shots that clustered so tight on the target she could have covered them with a playing card. The aging lawman was gone, replaced by something that moved with lethal grace. When he noticed her watching, Callahan simply nodded and holstered his weapon. "Some skills," he said quietly, "you never really forget. Just keep them hidden until they're needed." She noticed he'd removed the glove, revealing not just the knife scars she'd glimpsed before, but a series of notches carved into the grip of his peacemaker. Dozens of them, each one representing a story he'd never shared. As evening approached, Reed overheard a conversation between Callahan and Jim Morrison that shed new light on their sheriff's past. Morrison had brought news about Jackson Black's history, things he'd learned from his old ranger contacts. The name Marcus Hayes came up again, and this time the deputy caught more details. "Hayes was a legend in the Rangers," Morrison said, his voice low. "They say he trained a handful of men in his methods, taught them everything he knew about manhunting. Then something went wrong. Most of them turned bad, started using those skills for their own purposes." He studied Callahan's face carefully, all except one, the one they called Iron Hand, the one who hunted down his own brothers when they crossed the line. Callahan's response was lost in the evening breeze, but his expression spoke volumes. The weight of past decisions, of old loyalties betrayed and bloody justice delivered, seemed to settle around his shoulders like his worn leather duster. The badge on his chest caught the last rays of sunlight, a symbol not just of law, but of choices made and prices paid. That night, as Shadow Creek settled into an uneasy quiet, something fundamental had shifted. The 3 strangers rode out just before sunset, carrying their report back to Jackson Black. They would tell him about a seemingly vulnerable town, about an aging sheriff who moved stiffly and wore a glove on his right hand. What they couldn't report was the deadly truth hiding behind that peaceful facade, that Shadow Creek's guardian was far more than he appeared, and that the Black River Gang was riding toward a confrontation with a legend they thought long dead. The telegram arrived at dawn, its message stark in its brevity. "Silver City hit, bank burned, 7 dead, Black River Gang headed north." Sheriff Callahan read the words twice, his weathered face revealing nothing, but his gloved hand tightened imperceptibly on the yellow paper. Deputy Reed, watching his mentor's reaction, noticed how the morning light caught old scars on the sheriff's exposed neck. Rope burns by the look of them, long healed but never forgotten. Silver City lay just 2 days' ride south of Shadow Creek, and its destruction painted a clear picture of what awaited them. Throughout the morning, more details filtered in through stage drivers and travelers. The Black River Gang had evolved their tactics, becoming more organized, more ruthless. They'd sealed the exits before starting the fire, ensuring maximum casualties. Jackson Black himself had stood in the street, watching the bank burn while holding the town marshal's family hostage. "They're sending a message," Callahan explained to the town council, gathered in emergency session at Emma Parker's cafe. "Each attack gets worse. They're building a reputation on fear." His voice remained steady, but those who knew him well caught the undertone of cold anger. "Silver City had twice our population, a proper police force. Blacks telling us we don't stand a chance." Augustus Webb, still haunted by his experience in Willow Springs, voiced what many were thinking. "Maybe we should send for the army. The cavalry post at Fort Garrison is only 3 days' ride." The suggestion hung in the air like gun smoke after a firefight, but Callahan's response cut through it with quiet authority. "Army won't get here in time. Besides," he adjusted his glove with deliberate care, "bringing in soldiers would just make Black burn the town faster. Man like that, he enjoys an audience for his work." The sheriff's words carried the weight of personal knowledge, though none present yet understood how deep that knowledge ran. Dr. Wheeler, studying Callahan's face during the meeting, noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. The careful facade of age had slipped further, revealing glimpses of the man beneath, a predator assessing his hunting ground. When he outlined his defensive plans, his voice took on a tone of command that made even the most skeptical council members straighten in their chairs. Throughout the day, Shadow Creek transformed under Callahan's quiet direction. The bank's windows were reinforced, shooting positions established in key buildings. Emma Parker organized the townswomen to prepare medical supplies and emergency rations. Even the children were given roles, acting as messengers and lookouts under the sheriff's instruction. Jim Morrison, watching these preparations from his usual spot, shared insights with Deputy Reed about their significance. "Notice how he's setting it up, creating kill zones, establishing fallback positions. That's not standard law enforcement strategy, that's military thinking. The kind you learn hunting men who hunt back." By afternoon, 3 more strangers had ridden into town. Different from the previous scouts, these men carried themselves with the coiled tension of experienced gunfighters. They took rooms at the hotel, claiming to be poker players waiting for a big game. Callahan let them stay, but positioned trusted townsmen to watch their movements. "Why not run them out?" Reed asked, cleaning his rifle as evening approached. The sheriff's response was measured, tactical. "They're here to test our resolve, see if we spook easily. Running them off would tell Black exactly what he wants to know, that we're afraid." He paused, checking the action of his peacemaker. "Besides, better to know where your enemies are than wonder where they're hiding." As sunset painted the mountains copper and gold, Dr. Wheeler made a discovery that added new layers to the brewing conflict. Treating one of the stranger's slight injuries, she noticed a distinctive tattoo on his wrist, a coiled serpent, the mark of Marcus Hayes's infamous band of manhunters. When she mentioned this to Callahan, his reaction was subtle but significant. "Hayes marked all his students," he said quietly, unconsciously rubbing his gloved right hand. "Believed in branding his property." The bitter edge in his voice spoke of personal history, of old wounds that went deeper than flesh. For the first time, Wheeler understood the true significance of the glove. It wasn't hiding scars, but erasing a past connection. Night settled over Shadow Creek like a held breath. The 3 gunfighters remained in their rooms, occasionally visible through lit windows, playing their roles while studying the town's defenses. In his office, Callahan worked late, reviewing maps and old wanted posters. One yellow document caught Reed's attention, a faded photograph showing 5 men standing before a Texas Ranger camp. Though younger, the sheriff was clearly recognizable. standing next to a tall man with cold eyes who could only be Marcus Hayes. "They called us the Iron Brigade," Callahan said, noticing Reed's interest. "Hayes's special unit, trained for hunting the worst outlaws in Texas. We were good at it. Too good. Power like that, it changes men." His voice carried the weight of bitter experience. Hayes started seeing himself as above the law, started choosing targets based on profit instead of justice, when some of us objected. He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. The gloved hand moved unconsciously to old scars visible above his collar, the rope burns Reed had noticed earlier. The deputy began to understand that the coming conflict was more than just a sheriff defending his town. It was the final act of a tragedy that had begun years ago under the Texas sun. Outside, Shadow Creek's streets lay quiet under the stars. Tomorrow would bring violence, everyone could feel it in their bones. But tonight, they took comfort in knowing their aging sheriff was more than he appeared. None yet realized just how much more, or how personal the coming storm would become. The confrontation that would shatter Shadow Creek's illusions about their sheriff began in the hour before dawn. The three gunfighters from the hotel made their move just as the eastern sky began to pale, believing the early hour would find the town at its most vulnerable. They had studied Shadow Creek's routines, noted its weaknesses, and prepared a calculated display of force meant to demonstrate the futility of resistance against the Black River Gang. What they hadn't counted on was Sheriff Marcus Callahan's lifetime of experience with men who thought like predators. He had anticipated their timing, understanding that those who hunt the innocent prefer the uncertain light of dawn. The sheriff sat in his darkened office, his gloved hand resting near his peacemaker, watching the street through a gap in the curtains, while Deputy Reed maintained his usual visible patrol, playing his role in this deadly theater. Dr. Wheeler, returning from attending a difficult birth at the Peterson farm, witnessed what followed. Later, she would recall how the scene unfolded with the terrible precision of a Greek tragedy. The three gunfighters emerged from the hotel simultaneously, spreading out across the street with practiced coordination. Their intent was clear: to control the main thoroughfare and demonstrate their dominance through a display of coordinated violence. The leader, a scarred man with a snake tattoo visible at his wrist, called out to Deputy Reed with calculated insolence, "Boy, reckon it's time you and that worn-out old sheriff of yours learned how things are going to be." His companions moved to flanking positions, their hands hovering near holstered weapons. "Jackson Black sends his regards and a message about the price of resistance." What happened next would be retold in Shadow Creek for years to come. Sheriff Callahan seemed to materialize from the shadows of his office porch, moving with a speed and grace that belied his supposed age. His voice, when it came, carried none of its usual quiet restraint. Instead, it rang with the authority of cold steel. "Hayes taught you boys to control the street first," he said, causing the scarred man's eyes to widen at the reference. "Taught you to spread out, dominate the space. But he always said position means nothing if you forget to watch the high ground." The gunfighters realized too late that they had walked into a carefully prepared trap. Jim Morrison and several trusted townsmen had taken positions in the upper windows of surrounding buildings during the night, covering the street with rifles. But it was Callahan himself who commanded their attention, standing relaxed but alert, his gloved right hand hanging near his holstered peacemaker. The scarred man's recognition came too late. "Iron Hand," he breathed, the color draining from his face. "They said you were dead." Callahan's response carried the weight of years of violence contained. Hayes spread that story, helped him sleep better at night, I expect. The morning light caught the sheriff's badge, a bright point of law against his dark coat. "Now, you boys have a choice. Drop your guns and carry a message back to Black, or find out why Hayes named me Iron Hand in the first place." What followed happened so quickly that witnesses later disagreed on the exact sequence of events. The scarred man went for his gun with the swift brutality that marked Hayes's training. His companions moved in practiced coordination, each drawing down on the sheriff from different angles. They were fast, their movements speaking of years of experience in violence. Callahan was faster. Dr. Wheeler, who had seen her share of gunfights during the war, would later say she had never witnessed anything like it. The sheriff's draw was a blur of motion, his peacemaker seeming to materialize in his hand. 2 shots rang out almost as one, and 2 of the gunfighters fell, their weapons unfired. The third managed to squeeze off a round that whistled harmlessly past Callahan's head before a third shot ended his participation in the morning's events. The silence that followed seemed to ring with the echoes of gunfire. Callahan moved with practiced efficiency, kicking weapons away from fallen men while Deputy Reed and the townsmen covered him from their positions. 2 of the gunfighters were dead, their final expressions showing surprise more than pain. The scarred man lived, though his right arm would never draw a gun again. "Tell Black what you saw here," Callahan instructed the wounded man, his voice returning to its usual quiet tone. "Tell him Iron Hand sends his regards and that Shadow Creek isn't going to burn like Silver City." He paused, then added with deadly significance, "Tell him I remember what Hayes taught us about fear, about making examples." The transformation in the town's perception was immediate and profound. They had known Sheriff Callahan as a quiet, aging lawman who preferred words to violence. Now they saw him for what he truly was, a legendary manhunter who had hidden his deadly skills behind a badge, waiting for the day they would be needed again. Emma Parker, watching from her cafe doorway, noticed how his posture had changed, the careful stoop of age replaced by the straight-backed bearing of a warrior. Dr. Wheeler, treating the wounded gunfighter before his departure, observed how the other men now gave the sheriff a wider berth, their respect tinged with a new awareness of the predator in their midst. Yet it was Deputy Reed who perhaps understood best what had just transpired. This wasn't just a demonstration of skill. It was a message written in blood and gun smoke. The Black River Gang had probed Shadow Creek's defenses, expecting to find weakness. Instead, they had discovered that their chosen prey was perhaps the most dangerous man in the territories. As the morning sun finally crested the eastern mountains, Shadow Creek knew that everything had changed. The quiet peace they had known was gone, replaced by the certainty of coming violence. But they also knew that their aging sheriff was far more than he had appeared. He was Iron Hand Callahan, the legend who had hunted the hunters, and he had chosen their town as the place to make his final stand. Word of the dawn confrontation spread through Shadow Creek like wildfire, transforming the town's understanding of their sheriff and their situation. The morning's events had pulled back the curtain on Sheriff Callahan's carefully maintained facade, revealing the steel beneath the silver hair. As Dr. Wheeler tended to the wounded gunfighter before his departure, she observed how the town's perception shifted with each retelling of the encounter, the story growing in the telling until it seemed more legend than fact. The reality, she knew, was more remarkable than the embellishments. She had witnessed the impossible speed of Callahan's draw, the surgical precision of his shots. 3 men, all trained killers, had been dispatched with an efficiency that spoke of countless similar encounters. More telling was how the sheriff had handled the aftermath, moving through his duties with the same methodical care he showed in everything, as if the gunfight had been nothing more unusual than his morning coffee. Deputy Reed found himself dealing with a transformed mentor. The careful stoop was gone from Callahan's shoulders, replaced by the straight-backed bearing of a veteran gunfighter. The quiet suggestions had become clear commands, delivered with the authority of someone used to directing men in life-or-death situations. Even the way the sheriff moved had changed, each step measured and purposeful, his gloved hand never far from his peacemaker. "You've been planning for this," Reed observed as they secured the bodies for transport. All these years, you were preparing for something like this." Callahan's response was characteristically measured but heavy with meaning. "Man like Hayes, he teaches you to think ahead, to see the patterns. I knew someday the past would catch up, just didn't expect it to wear Black's face." Throughout the morning, more details of Callahan's history emerged through fragments of conversation and half-remembered tales. Jim Morrison, his memory jogged by the morning's events, shared stories he'd heard during his ranger days about the Iron Brigade's exploits. "They were legend in Texas," he told the gathered crowd at Emma's Cafe. 5 men trained by Hayes himself, each one deadly in his own right. But Iron Hand, he was different. They say he could read men's intentions like others read tracks, spot a killer by the way he carried his gun. Emma Parker, serving coffee to the morning's impromptu gathering, noticed how the townspeople's attitudes had shifted. The respect they'd always shown Callahan now carried an edge of awe, tinged with the natural wariness that comes from discovering a wolf had been guarding their flock. Yet there was comfort in that knowledge too, a growing confidence that perhaps Shadow Creek stood a chance against the approaching storm. By midday, the wounded gunfighter had been patched up and sent on his way, carrying Black's message and nursing both a shattered arm and wounded pride. Dr. Wheeler, watching him ride out, shared her observations with the sheriff. "He'll need months to heal if the arm ever works right again." Callahan's response was quiet but pointed. "Hayes taught us to make examples, some lessons you never forget." The afternoon brought new developments as travelers arrived with fresh news of the Black River Gang's movements. They had left Silver City in ruins, but their progress north had slowed, suggesting they were gathering reinforcements. Each report added to the picture of an approaching force that combined military precision with outlaw brutality, led by a man whose reputation for creative cruelty grew with each telling. Callahan received these reports in his office, marking positions on a map while his mind worked through the calculations of survival. Deputy Reed, watching his mentor work, began to understand the depth of experience behind each decision. The sheriff wasn't just preparing for a fight, he was orchestrating a complex defensive strategy that transformed Shadow Creek's very geography into a weapon. "Black will have learned from his scout's failure," Callahan explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "He'll come in force next time, try to overwhelm us with numbers." He traced a line on the map with his gloved finger. "But Hayes taught us all the same lessons about attacking defended positions. Black will follow the playbook. He doesn't have the imagination to do otherwise." As evening approached, the town's transformation continued under Callahan's direction. Strategic positions were reinforced, signals arranged between buildings, and emergency plans refined. The sheriff worked with the precision of a military commander, each instruction backed by years of hard-won knowledge. Those who watched him closely noticed how he seemed to anticipate problems before they arose, addressing weaknesses in their defenses that only a veteran manhunter would recognize. Augustus Webb, still haunted by his memories of Willow Springs, found new confidence in watching these preparations. "It's different here," he told Dr. Wheeler as they helped stockpile medical supplies. "In Willow Springs, we were sheep waiting for the wolves. Here, we've got a wolf of our own, one who's been waiting for this fight." The sun was setting when a dust-covered rider arrived with the news they'd been expecting. The Black River Gang had been spotted 30 miles south, their numbers swelled to nearly 40 men. They were moving slowly, deliberately, making no effort to hide their approach. It was a statement of confidence, a declaration that they feared no resistance. In his office, Callahan received this news with characteristic calm, but those who knew him well saw the subtle signs of anticipation in his bearing. The legendary manhunter who had hidden behind the badge for 5 years was fully awake now, preparing to meet violence with violence. Shadow Creek was about to become the stage for a confrontation years in the making, a reckoning between men who had once called each other brother before choosing different paths. As darkness settled over the town, Deputy Reed found the sheriff on his office porch, staring south toward the approaching storm. The badge on his chest caught the last light of day, a symbol not just of law, but of choices made and prices paid. Tomorrow would bring violence on a scale Shadow Creek had never seen, but tonight they took comfort in knowing their aging sheriff was actually something far more dangerous, a legend who had been patiently waiting for this moment of truth. The night brought an unexpected visitor to Shadow Creek, one who would shed new light on the brewing conflict. Sarah Wheeler was tending to her evening rounds when she noticed a rider approaching from the east, an elderly man wearing a weather-beaten Texas Ranger badge. He dismounted stiffly outside the sheriff's office, his movements suggesting old wounds that had never quite healed. The doctor recognized the bearing of a man who had seen his share of violence, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. They carried the same haunted weight she'd noticed in Callahan's. Sheriff Callahan emerged from his office at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, his hand instinctively near his holstered peacemaker. His reaction to the visitor spoke volumes, a slight straightening of his posture, a barely perceptible nod of recognition. "Marshal Harrison," he said quietly, "long ride from Austin." The older man's response carried equal weight. "Some rides need making, Marcus, especially when Hayes's ghosts start walking again." Inside the office, Deputy Reed observed the reunion of two men who had clearly shared history. Harrison removed his coat, revealing an intricate network of scars on his left arm, rope burns similar to those on Callahan's neck. The marshal's arrival seemed to lift some invisible weight from the sheriff's shoulders, as if the presence of someone who understood his past made the burden easier to bear. "Word reached Austin about Black's movements," Harrison explained, accepting a cup of coffee from Reed. "When I heard he was heading for Shadow Creek, I knew it couldn't be coincidence. Hayes trained us too well to believe in coincidences." He studied Callahan's face carefully. "How long have you been waiting for this, Marcus?" The sheriff's response was measured, but heavy with meaning. 5 years, since I heard what Black did to his own family, what Hayes's teachings turned him into." He removed his glove, revealing not just the scars, but a familiar snake tattoo, matching the one the wounded gunfighter had worn. "Some debts can only be paid in blood." Harrison shared details that filled crucial gaps in the story. The Iron Brigade's fall from grace hadn't been sudden, but a gradual corruption of purpose. Hayes had started them as an elite unit of manhunters, but success had bred arrogance, and arrogance had led to darkness. "We were too good at what we did," Harrison explained. Hayes began to see himself as judge, jury, and executioner, started targeting anyone he deemed unworthy of life. The marshal's words painted a picture of how Hayes had transformed skilled lawmen into something darker. He called it pruning the tree of civilization, Harrison continued, his voice bitter with memory. Said some men needed killing for society to flourish. Black was the first to fully embrace that philosophy, started enjoying the work too much. Callahan listened silently, his gloved hand absently tracing the grip of his peacemaker. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of long-held pain. Hayes discovered I was gathering evidence against him, decided to make an example. Had Black and the others string me up, left me for dead. His hand moved to the rope scars on his neck. Harrison found me, got me down in time. That's when we learned the true cost of Hayes's teaching. The story that emerged through their conversation revealed layers of tragedy that went beyond simple outlawry. Black had taken Hayes's lessons about fear and control to new extremes, turning them into a philosophy of terror. What he did in Silver City, Harrison explained, that wasn't just about money. That was him proving he'd surpassed his teacher, showing he could break not just bodies, but spirits. Dr. Wheeler, who had remained to tend to Harrison's old injuries, noticed how the conversation seemed to age both men. They spoke of former brothers in arms who had chosen darkness over law, of how Hayes's teachings about justice had become perverted into exercises in cruelty. More telling were the details they didn't share, the names they wouldn't speak, suggesting wounds too deep for words. As midnight approached, Harrison shared intelligence about Black's growing force. He's gathered every hard case and killer between here and the Mexican border. Men who've heard the stories about Iron Hand and want to prove themselves against the legend. He paused, studying his old friend. They don't know it's you, Marcus. Hayes's last student, the one who never broke. The revelation of Callahan's true identity as Hayes's most gifted student added new dimensions to the coming conflict. Jim Morrison, invited to join the discussion for his tactical knowledge, understood the implications immediately. "That's why your preparations looked so familiar," he said. "You're using Hayes's own strategies against them." Deputy Reed, listening intently, began to see the larger picture. Every move Callahan had made since taking the badge in Shadow Creek had been preparation for this moment. He had chosen the ground, studied the terrain, and waited patiently for the day when his past would demand a reckoning. The quiet lawman they had known was merely the surface of a much deeper, more dangerous man. The night deepened as the three veterans planned, their discussion ranging from tactics to old wounds, never fully healed. Harrison's presence brought not just additional firepower, but validation of Callahan's methods. Here was another man who understood the true nature of their opponent, who had seen firsthand how Hayes's teachings could twist men's souls. "Black will come at dawn," Callahan concluded, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Hayes always taught that fear is strongest in the half-light. He'll want to make a show of it, prove he's more than just another outlaw." The sheriff's expression hardened. "But Hayes taught me something he never taught the others. Sometimes the best trap is the one your enemy thinks he's setting himself." As Harrison prepared to check the town's defenses, he shared one final piece of information that cast the coming battle in an even darker light. "Hayes is still out there, Marcus. Some say he's watching, waiting to see how his students measure up." The marshal's words hung in the air, like gunsmoke. This isn't just about Black anymore. It's about ending what started in Texas all those years ago. The gravity of this revelation settled over the office like a shroud. Shadow Creek wasn't just facing a gang of outlaws. It was about to become the battleground for a conflict that had been brewing for years. A test of what happens when justice becomes twisted into vengeance, and how far a man will go to right the wrongs of the past. The pre-dawn hours brought the first tangible signs of the Black River Gang's approach. Marshal Harrison, patrolling the town's outskirts, spotted signal fires in the distant hills, not attempts at concealment, but deliberate warnings meant to fray nerves and erode resolve. Sheriff Callahan recognized the tactic immediately. It was straight from Hayes's handbook on psychological warfare, a method of wearing down resistance before the first shot was fired. Deputy Reed found Callahan and Harrison studying these distant flames from the jail's roof, their expressions grave in the flickering light. The marshal's weathered face showed concern as he gestured toward the southeastern horizon. "They're not hiding their numbers anymore. Must be 40 fires out there, maybe more." Callahan's response carried the weight of experience. Black's following Hayes's doctrine to the letter. Show of force first. Make your target feel overwhelmed before you even move in. The morning brought more evidence of the gang's methodical approach. 3 ranch horses galloped into town, their saddles empty, but bearing crude messages carved into the leather. Dr. Wheeler, examining the animals, found each bearing identical marks, the serpent symbol of Hayes's brotherhood, but modified with a diagonal slash that Harrison recognized as Black's personal signature. "He's announcing himself," Callahan explained to the gathered town council, his voice steady despite the implicit threat. "Wants us to know exactly who's coming." The sheriff's gloved hand rested near his peacemaker as he continued. "But he's also revealing his state of mind. Hayes taught us that a man who needs to proclaim his power usually doubts it." Emma Parker's cafe became an impromptu command center as Callahan, Harrison, and selected townsmen refined their defensive strategy. The sheriff's tactical acumen showed clearly now, each instruction reflecting years of experience in violent confrontation. He positioned shooters with the precision of a military commander, ensuring overlapping fields of fire while identifying potential weaknesses in their defense. "Notice how he thinks in layers," Harrison explained to Deputy Reed as they checked ammunition supplies. "That's Hayes's advanced training. Most men think about winning the fight. Marcus thinks about winning the entire battle before it starts." The marshal's words carried both admiration and warning. Black learned the same lessons, but he never had the patience to master them like your sheriff did. By mid-morning, more signs of the gang's approach emerged. Travelers reported seeing armed men establishing positions in the surrounding hills, cutting off escape routes while maintaining visible presence. It was a strategy meant to induce panic, to make the town feel like a trap slowly closing. But in Shadow Creek, under Callahan's quiet leadership, the response was methodical preparation rather than fear. Dr. Wheeler, organizing medical supplies with help from the town's women, observed how Callahan's influence had transformed the community. Instead of chaos, there was purpose. Rather than panic, there was grim determination. The sheriff had somehow transmitted his own steady resolve to the townspeople, turning potential victims into defenders. A dust-covered rider arrived around noon, bringing intelligence that made Harrison's face darken. "Black's got artillery," the scout reported, describing a modified mountain howitzer being transported with the main force. "Looks like they stripped it from a military outpost." This news prompted a swift modification of Callahan's defense plans, though his expression remained unchanged. "Hayes always said artillery was a crutch for men who couldn't win with skill," the sheriff remarked, making adjustments to their preparations. "Black's trying to compensate for something. He knows what he's riding into, even if he won't admit it to himself." The calm certainty in his voice steadied nerves among those who overheard. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Augustus Webb noticed something that spoke volumes about the approaching confrontation. The sheriff had removed his badge, carefully placing it in his desk drawer. When questioned, Callahan's response was quietly significant. "What's coming isn't about law anymore. It's about finishing something that started long ago in Texas." The transformation in Callahan became more pronounced as evening approached. The careful movements of the aging lawman gave way to the fluid grace of a veteran gunfighter. Even his voice changed, carrying an edge of authority that demanded immediate compliance. Harrison watched this emergence with knowing eyes, recognizing the return of the man he'd known in Texas. "You've got that same look you had before Phantom Ridge," the marshal observed as they made final preparations. The mention of that name caused Callahan to pause, his gloved hand tightening imperceptibly. Phantom Ridge had been the Iron Brigade's bloodiest victory, a confrontation that had revealed the first signs of Hayes's descent into darkness. "Difference is," Callahan replied, checking his peacemaker with practiced care, "this time we're on the right side of justice." The statement carried layers of meaning, acknowledging past sins while affirming present purpose. Shadow Creek wasn't just another battlefield, it was a chance for redemption. As night fell, the town settled into tense vigilance. The distant fires had multiplied, creating a ring of light that emphasized their isolation. Black was implementing Hayes's siege tactics perfectly, but he was operating from a flawed assumption. He believed he was hunting an aging sheriff in a vulnerable town. Instead, he was walking into a confrontation with Hayes's most accomplished student in a battlefield of that student's choosing. Marshal Harrison, completing his final rounds, found Callahan on the jail's porch, his attention focused southward where the gang's fires painted the horizon. "Dawn's going to be interesting," the marshal remarked, the understatement heavy with meaning. Callahan's response was characteristic in its quiet certainty. "Hayes taught us all about using dawn to maximize fear. But he never understood that sometimes the thing you're trying to frighten is more dangerous than you are." In the gathering darkness, Shadow Creek waited. The next sunrise would bring violence on a scale the town had never seen. But under Callahan's guidance, they were as ready as they could be. The legend of Iron Hand was about to face its greatest test, and the price of failure would be measured in blood and fire. The transformation of Shadow Creek reached its culmination in the hours before Black's anticipated assault. Under Sheriff Callahan's guidance, the town had evolved from a collection of individuals into a coordinated force. What began as fear had crystallized into determination, shaped by the quiet strength of their legendary protector. Dr. Wheeler, observing from her clinic window, noted how the changes went beyond mere physical preparations. The townspeople moved with newfound purpose, each understanding their role in the coming confrontation. Even the children had adapted, serving as messengers between defensive positions, their natural energy channeled into useful action. Marshal Harrison, conducting a final inspection of their defenses, shared his observations with Deputy Reed. "This is what separates Marcus from Hayes's other students," he explained, watching townsmen reinforce building positions. "Hayes taught us to break people's spirits. Marcus learned how to strengthen them instead." The marshal's words carried the weight of personal experience, understanding how his old friend had turned Hayes's teachings toward protection rather than destruction. Emma Parker's cafe had become more than a command center. It transformed into the heart of the town's resistance. The owner herself had organized a network of support that would prove crucial in the coming fight. "Sheriff Callahan showed us that defending a town isn't just about guns," she told the women working alongside her. "It's about making sure every person knows they're part of something larger." Augustus Webb, who had once fled in terror from the Black River Gang, found himself volunteering for a defensive position. The change in him reflected the larger transformation in Shadow Creek. "Used to think courage meant not being afraid," he confided to Dr. Wheeler as she checked his rifle. "Sheriff showed us it's about standing firm despite the fear." Callahan himself remained the calm center of this storm of preparation. His movements through town carried the fluid grace of a predator, his previous pretense of age completely abandoned. Those who watched him work saw a man perfectly in his element, every action precise and purposeful. The gloved hand no longer seemed a mark of injury, but a reminder of his true identity as Iron Hand. The sheriff's tactical acumen revealed itself in layers. He had transformed Shadow Creek's layout into a complex defensive system, using the town's geography to create what Harrison called a killing ground with layers. Each street, each building, each line of sight had been considered and incorporated into their strategy. More impressively, he had taught the townspeople to understand and use these advantages. "Notice how he set it up," Jim Morrison explained to a group of volunteers, his ranger experience helping him appreciate the sophistication of Callahan's plan. Each position supports two others. Lose one, you fall back to prepared spots that let you protect three more. It's like a web where every strand strengthens the whole. As evening approached, Marshal Harrison gathered key defenders in Emma's cafe for final instructions. The meeting revealed how thoroughly Callahan had prepared for this moment. Maps showed multiple fallback positions, escape routes, and rally points. More importantly, they demonstrated how each defender's role connected to the larger strategy. Black thinks he's dealing with scared townspeople and an aging lawman, Harrison told the assembled group. He's expecting to find sheep ready for slaughter. Instead, he's riding into a trap laid by the one man who truly understood Hayes's teachings. The marshal's words carried both warning and promise. Tomorrow we'll test everything you've learned, everything you've become. Dr. Wheeler, attending the meeting to coordinate medical response, noticed how Callahan had positioned their few experienced fighters to maximum effect. Morrison's ranger training, Reed's young energy, and Harrison's veteran presence were all leveraged to strengthen less experienced defenders. Even her medical teams were integrated into the tactical plan, positioned to provide swift aid while remaining protected. The sheriff's instructions were characteristically precise and thorough. Each defender received clear directions about their position, their objectives, and their fallback plans. More importantly, they understood how their role contributed to the larger strategy. This wasn't just about surviving, it was about working together to defeat a superior force. As night settled over Shadow Creek, the distant fires of the Black River Gang created a ring of light around the town. The sight might have been terrifying a few days ago. Now it served as a reminder of what they faced and why they needed to stand together. Callahan made his final rounds as darkness deepened, checking positions and speaking quietly with defenders. His presence carried its own message. The legend of Iron Hand wasn't just about one man's skill with a gun, but about his ability to transform ordinary people into extraordinary defenders. The night air grew thick with anticipation, but the fear that Black had hoped to instill was largely absent. Instead, Shadow Creek hummed with purposeful activity. Supply lines were established, communications tested, positions reinforced. The town had become an organism working in concert, each part supporting the whole. In his office, Callahan shared a final moment with Harrison and Reed. The marshal studied his old friend's face in the lamplight, seeing both the deadly manhunter he'd known in Texas and something more, a leader who had found his true purpose. Hayes taught us that fear was the ultimate weapon, Callahan said quietly, checking his peacemaker one final time. He never understood that unity is stronger than fear. Black's about to learn that lesson the hard way. The sheriff's words carried absolute conviction, born of experience and deep understanding of both his enemy and his allies. Shadow Creek settled into its final night of peace, transformed from a vulnerable target into a unified force. Tomorrow would bring violence, but they would face it together, guided by a legend who had turned Hayes's doctrine of fear into a blueprint for courage and resistance. The final hours before dawn brought an eerie stillness to Shadow Creek. Sheriff Callahan stood on the jail's roof, his experienced eyes reading signs in the darkness that others might miss. The Black River Gang's fires had died to embers, a tactical choice he recognized from his training days. Jackson Black was implementing Hayes's siege doctrine with methodical precision, but Callahan could see the flaws in his approach. Marshal Harrison joined him on the roof, moving with the careful quiet of a veteran lawman. "They're positioning their artillery on the south ridge," he reported, his voice low. "Just where you said they would." Callahan nodded, unsurprised. The placement was textbook Hayes doctrine, exactly where he had predicted it would be. More importantly, it was precisely where he wanted it. Throughout Shadow Creek, final preparations proceeded with practiced efficiency. Dr. Wheeler had transformed the church basement into a field hospital, drawing on her wartime experience to create an efficient triage system. Emma Parker's network of runners stood ready to deliver supplies and messages between defensive positions. Even the town's children had their roles, positioned safely in reinforced cellars where they could help with ammunition distribution and basic medical support. Deputy Reed found himself struck by the mathematical precision of Callahan's preparations. Each defensive position supported multiple others, creating overlapping fields of fire that would force attackers into carefully prepared killing zones. The sheriff had turned Shadow Creek's architecture into a weapon, using Hayes's own tactical principles against his former students. "Black's making his first mistake," Callahan explained during a final briefing with key defenders. "He's thinking like a student, following the formulas Hayes taught us, but he never learned to adapt them." The sheriff's gloved hand traced patterns on their tactical map, showing how the gang's by-the-book approach would work against them. "He's positioning his men exactly where Hayes would have put them, exactly where we want them." The pre-dawn hours revealed more about Black's tactical approach. Scout reports confirmed the gang had divided into assault teams, each positioned according to Hayes's standard doctrine for attacking defended settlements. They had even brought the tools Hayes had favored: grappling hooks for scaling walls, smoke bombs for creating confusion, and the modified artillery piece for breaking defensive positions. "They're planning something big for dawn," Harrison observed, recognizing the pattern. "Hayes always said fear is strongest in half-light." The marshal's words carried the weight of experience, remembering other dawns, other battles. "Black's going to want to make a statement, prove he's more than just another outlaw." Callahan's response was quietly confident. "He's following a script we both learned by heart. Difference is, I've spent 5 years rewriting the ending." The sheriff's preparation showed in every detail, from the reinforced positions to the carefully planned fallback points. He had turned Shadow Creek into an elaborate trap, using his intimate knowledge of Hayes's tactics to predict and counter every move Black might make. The town's transformation was most evident in its defenders. Ordinary citizens had become disciplined fighters under Callahan's guidance. Augustus Webb, once terrified of the Black River Gang, now manned a defensive position with steady hands and clear purpose. Jim Morrison led a team of former soldiers, their military experience enhanced by Callahan's tactical instruction. Even Dr. Wheeler's medical teams operated with military precision, prepared for the casualties that would inevitably come. As the eastern sky began to pale, the first signs of the gang's advance appeared. Shadows moved at the town's edges, probing for weaknesses. Occasional shots rang out, not serious attempts at attack, but tests of the defenders' discipline. Callahan had prepared them for this, teaching them to hold their fire, to wait for the real assault. "Notice how they're moving," Harrison pointed out to Deputy Reed, watching the gang's probing attacks. 3-man teams, coordinated coverage, just like Hayes taught us. Black's trying to demonstrate his mastery of the old methods. The marshal's tone carried a hint of dismissal. "But he's fighting yesterday's battle. Marcus has moved beyond the formula." The sheriff's quiet confidence infected the entire town. Defenders checked their weapons with steady hands, secure in their understanding of the larger strategy. Supply teams moved between positions with purposeful efficiency, ensuring every location was properly equipped. The fear that Black had hoped to instill was notably absent, replaced by grim determination and unity of purpose. In the growing light, Callahan made his final preparations. The badge remained in his desk drawer. This wasn't about law enforcement anymore, but about finishing something that had started years ago in Texas. His peacemaker hung at his side, the worn grip carrying the history of countless confrontations. The glove on his right hand no longer concealed weakness, but symbolized the return of Iron Hand. The first rays of sun painted the eastern sky in shades of blood red as Jackson Black's initial moves became clear. The artillery on the south ridge began ranging shots, testing distances. Mounted raiders appeared briefly at the town's edges, their movements coordinated and precise. Everything proceeded according to Hayes's tactical doctrine, exactly as Callahan had predicted. "He's going to open with artillery to shake our nerve," the sheriff explained to his defenders, his voice carrying calm authority. "Then mounted raiders to test our positions, followed by the main assault when he thinks we're rattled." Each prediction demonstrated his deep understanding of both the tactical doctrine they'd all learned and the man implementing it. Shadow Creek waited in disciplined silence as dawn approached. The town had become more than just a battlefield. It was the culmination of 5 years of preparation, the place where Iron Hand would finally settle accounts with Hayes's twisted legacy. The coming violence would test not just their defenses, but the very principles Callahan had worked to instill. The sun crested the horizon as the first artillery shell screamed toward Shadow Creek. The battle for the town was about to begin, but unlike Willow Springs or Silver City, this time the predators would find themselves facing something they didn't expect. A unified force led by the one man who truly understood their methods, and who had spent years preparing for this moment of reckoning. The first artillery shell struck Shadow Creek's water tower, sending a cascade of timber and water into the street below. Jackson Black had chosen his initial target with tactical precision, attempting to deprive the defenders of a crucial resource while creating chaos. What he didn't know was that Sheriff Callahan had emptied the tower days ago, replacing the valuable water supply with sawdust and sand to create a dramatic but ultimately meaningless explosion. Marshal Harrison, watching from his position near the church, recognized the sophistication of Callahan's preparation. "He's letting Black think his first strike succeeded," the marshal explained to Deputy Reed, "making him overconfident." True to prediction, the artillery's successful first shot was followed by a barrage aimed at other key structures, all of which had been similarly prepared and reinforced. The mounted raiders struck next, exactly as Callahan had anticipated. They came in 3 waves, each designed to test different aspects of the town's defenses. The first group probed the eastern approaches, seeking weak points in the defensive line. The second struck from the west, attempting to split the defenders' attention. The third and largest wave charged straight down Main Street. Their thundering hooves, accompanied by war cries, meant to shatter morale. But Shadow Creek was ready. The eastern raiders found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire, precision rifle fire from concealed positions, forcing them to withdraw with heavy losses. The western attack encountered a series of barricades that channeled them into prepared killing zones, and the main charge down Main Street ran headlong into Callahan's most carefully planned trap. The sheriff had positioned his most experienced shooters in elevated positions along the street, their rifles supported by townspeople who had trained for weeks for this moment. As the raiders charged into the apparent vulnerability of the open street, these defenders opened fire with devastating accuracy. Horses fell, riders tumbled, and the proud charge dissolved into chaos. Dr. Wheeler, watching from her medical station, observed how Callahan's meticulous planning paid off in saved lives. The few defenders who took injuries were quickly moved through pre-planned routes to medical care, while the attacking forces suffered disproportionate casualties. Every aspect of the town's response showed the benefits of careful preparation and unified purpose. Black's reaction to this initial setback demonstrated both his adherence to Hayes's teachings and his limitations in applying them. The artillery shifted its focus to suspected defensive positions, following the standard doctrine for reducing resistance. But Callahan had anticipated this as well, having prepared hardened positions that appeared vulnerable while actually providing excellent protection. "Watch how he's drawing them in," Callahan explained to his key defenders during a brief lull. "Black's following Hayes's playbook step by step. Next comes the infantry assault, trying to exploit the confusion he thinks he's created." The sheriff's prediction proved accurate as groups of dismounted gang members began advancing under cover of artillery fire, using smoke bombs to mask their movement. The battle shifted into a new phase as Black's men engaged in close-quarters combat throughout the town. Here, Callahan's careful preparation of the battlefield proved decisive. Every street had been subtly modified to channel attackers into prepared crossfire zones. Buildings that appeared vulnerable concealed strong defensive positions. The town itself had become a weapon in Iron Hand's arsenal. Augustus Webb, manning a defensive position near Emma's Cafe, found himself in the thick of the fighting. The former banker who had once fled in terror now held his ground with steady nerve, his actions guided by Callahan's training. When a group of raiders attempted to flank their position, Webb's team responded with coordinated fire that drove them back with heavy losses. Marshal Harrison, coordinating the defense of the church sector, witnessed the full sophistication of Callahan's strategy. The sheriff had created a defensive system that could bend without breaking, each position supporting others in an intricate web of coverage. When the gang managed to take one position, they found themselves exposed to fire from three others. The true revelation came in how Callahan had prepared for Black's tactical responses. Each time the gang adapted their approach, they found themselves facing countermeasures specifically designed to exploit their new strategy. It was as if the sheriff was playing both sides of a chess game, anticipating and countering moves before they were made. Emma Parker's network of runners proved invaluable, maintaining communication between defensive positions despite the chaos of battle. Their practiced efficiency allowed Callahan to adjust his defense in real time, shifting resources to meet threats as they developed. The town functioned like a single organism, each part supporting the whole under Iron Hand's guidance. By mid-morning, Black's initial assault had been thoroughly repulsed. The gang's losses were significant, while Shadow Creek's defenders had suffered only minor casualties. More importantly, the town's morale remained high, each successful defense strengthening their confidence and unity of purpose. Yet Callahan knew this was only the beginning. Black had more men in reserve, and Hayes's teachings included strategies for prolonged siege warfare. The gang leader would adapt his approach, seeking new ways to break the town's resistance. But Iron Hand had prepared for this as well, each defensive success part of a larger strategy designed to shape the final confrontation that was yet to come. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Shadow Creek stood bloodied but unbowed. The legend of Iron Hand was proving itself not just in gunfighting skill, but in the ability to transform an ordinary town into an impregnable fortress. The next phase of battle would test this transformation even further, as Jackson Black prepared to unleash everything he had learned from Hayes in a desperate attempt to break the will of a town defended by the Master's greatest student. The tide of battle shifted with devastating suddenness shortly after noon. Jackson Black, stung by his initial failures, revealed why Hayes had considered him the most dangerous of his students. The gang leader had been probing Shadow Creek's defenses, not just to find weaknesses, but to identify the tactical patterns that revealed Callahan's hand in their creation. The attack began with an unexpected movement of the artillery. Instead of continuing its bombardment of the town's obvious defensive positions, the gun suddenly fell silent. Marshal Harrison, recognizing the significance of this change, found Callahan in his command position near the church. "He's finally thinking for himself," the sheriff observed grimly, moving beyond Hayes's teachings. Black's new strategy became apparent moments later when multiple explosions rocked Shadow Creek's northwestern quarter. The gang had used the artillery's previous attacks as cover to move demolition charges into position. The blasts breached several key defensive positions, creating gaps in the carefully prepared fields of fire that had previously protected the town. Dr. Wheeler's medical station was suddenly overwhelmed with casualties as Black launched a coordinated assault through the gaps. The gang's elite gunfighters, held in reserve until this moment, struck with lethal precision. These were men chosen for their skill rather than their brutality, and their effectiveness showed in the mounting defender casualties. Deputy Reed, coordinating the defense of the compromised sector, witnessed the sophistication of Black's adapted strategy. The gang leader had identified the interconnected nature of Callahan's defensive system and found a way to disrupt its carefully planned support structure. When defenders fell back to their designated positions, they found their supporting positions already under attack. "He's not just following Hayes's book anymore," Harrison reported as they worked to contain the breach. "He's reading our responses, using our own patterns against us." The marshal's assessment was confirmed as Black's men demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate and counter the defenders' practiced maneuvers. The crisis deepened as smoke from the demolition charges began to fill the streets, obscuring sightlines and disrupting the coordinated defense that had served them so well. Emma Parker's runner network struggled to maintain communication between positions, leading to dangerous gaps in their defensive coverage. For the first time since the battle began, fear began to creep into the hearts of Shadow Creek's defenders. Callahan watched these developments with the focused intensity of a master strategist. Where others saw chaos, he recognized the underlying pattern in Black's assault. The gang leader had finally shed the limitations of Hayes's rigid doctrine and was demonstrating true tactical innovation. This was the moment Ironhand had been waiting for. "He's showing us who he really is," Callahan explained to his key defenders during a hurried conference. "Not Hayes's student anymore, but his own man. That makes him more dangerous and more predictable." The sheriff's gloved hand traced new patterns on their battle map, adjusting their strategy to meet this evolved threat. The afternoon brought more pressure as Black pressed his advantage. The gang's numbers, initially a disadvantage in the narrow streets, became an asset as they were able to sustain multiple simultaneous attacks. The defenders found themselves stretched thin, forced to abandon outer positions and fall back toward the town's center. Augustus Webb's position near the bank came under particularly heavy attack. The former banker proved his newfound courage, holding his ground even as casualties mounted around him. But courage alone couldn't overcome tactical reality. When Webb's runners reported running low on ammunition, the full extent of Black's strategy became clear. He was deliberately wearing down their resources. Dr. Wheeler, struggling to treat the increasing number of wounded, recognized a pattern in the casualties that spoke to Black's tactical sophistication. The gang was specifically targeting defenders who showed leadership abilities, attempting to decapitate the town's command structure. This wasn't just an assault on positions, it was an attempt to break the unity that gave Shadow Creek its strength. The crisis point came when Black's men managed to secure the water tower's ruins, giving them an elevated position overlooking several key defensive strongpoints. Marshal Harrison took a bullet in the shoulder while organizing a counterattack, and for a moment it seemed Shadow Creek's carefully prepared defense might unravel. Yet in this moment of apparent defeat, Callahan's deeper strategy began to reveal itself. The sheriff had anticipated not just Black's initial assault, but his eventual adaptation. Each fallback position, while appearing to be a retreat, was actually drawing the gang deeper into the town's center, where Ironhand had prepared his true killing ground. "Hayes taught us that victory comes from making your enemy think he's winning," Callahan told Deputy Reed as they organized their remaining forces. "Black's finally fighting his own battle, thinking his own thoughts. That means he's finally ready to face what's coming." The sheriff's quiet confidence, even in this moment of crisis, steadied nerves and restored focus among the defenders. As the sun began its westward descent, Shadow Creek appeared to be on the verge of falling. Black's forces had penetrated deeply into the town, controlling several key positions and maintaining steady pressure on the defenders. The gang leader had proven himself more adaptable and innovative than anyone except Callahan had expected. But those who knew Ironhand best recognized that the day's apparent setbacks were part of a larger design. The true battle for Shadow Creek was about to begin, and Jackson Black was about to learn why Hayes had considered Callahan his most dangerous student, not because of his skill with a gun, but because of his ability to turn apparent defeat into decisive victory. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Shadow Creek's blood-stained streets as Sheriff Callahan initiated the next phase of his strategy. What appeared to be a retreat toward the town's center was, in fact, the beginning of a carefully orchestrated trap. The defenders' apparent disarray masked a deadly purpose that even Marshal Harrison, with all his experience, was only beginning to understand. "Notice how he's positioned everyone," Harrison remarked to Deputy Reed as they regrouped in the church basement. Despite his wounded shoulder, the marshal's tactical mind remained sharp. Each fallback draws Black's men deeper into the town, but also separates them from their support. The artillery can't help them here without risking their own people. Dr. Wheeler, tending to the wounded, observed a subtle shift in the pattern of casualties. The defensive positions that remained were proving remarkably resilient, their casualties dropping significantly even as the fighting intensified. Callahan had concentrated his most experienced fighters in key locations, creating strong points that would anchor his counter-offensive. The transformation began with a series of coordinated actions that revealed the true sophistication of Iron Hand's strategy. Emma Parker's runner network, which had appeared compromised, suddenly demonstrated its real purpose. The messages they carried weren't just updates, but precise timing signals, coordinating actions across the entire town. Augustus Webb, defending what seemed to be a vulnerable position near the bank, received the first signal. His team's apparent ammunition shortage had drawn Black's men into aggressive advances. When the runner delivered a simple message, "Iron Hand sends regards," Webb's unit revealed their carefully hoarded ammunition reserves, catching the attackers in devastating crossfire. Similar scenes played out across Shadow Creek as Callahan's true defense plan unfolded. Positions that appeared weakened suddenly demonstrated overwhelming firepower. Retreating defenders turned to stand their ground, revealing that their withdrawal had been tactical rather than forced. The town's very architecture seemed to work against the gang, trapping them in killing zones they had thought were safe corridors. "This is what separated Marcus from the rest of us," Harrison explained to those nearby as the counter-offensive gained momentum. "Hayes taught us to break an enemy's strength. Marcus learned to turn their strength into weakness." The marshal's words proved prophetic as Black's tactical innovations began to work against him. The gang's deep penetration into the town, initially a success, now left them dangerously exposed. Callahan coordinated these efforts from a position that commanded views of key intersections. His gloved hand moved across the town map with precise purpose, directing runners to coordinate the complex sequence of counterattacks. Each movement was timed to support others, creating a web of coordinated action that slowly but surely began to trap the Black River Gang. The sophistication of Iron Hand's strategy became clear as the defenders began to retake lost ground. Each position they reclaimed strengthened their ability to support other recovery efforts. The gang found themselves caught in an ever-tightening noose, their apparent victories transformed into tactical vulnerabilities. Dr. Wheeler's medical station, which had been overwhelmed earlier, now operated with renewed efficiency. The casualties arriving were predominantly from the gang's ranks, brought in by townspeople who had maintained their discipline even in apparent defeat. The doctor noticed how even the wounded defenders seemed to understand their role in the larger strategy, their morale unbroken despite their injuries. Deputy Reed, witnessing Callahan's command of the situation, finally understood the full scope of what he had learned from his mentor. "The entire day has been one big lesson," he realized aloud. Teaching Black that everything Hayes taught him was just the beginning of understanding real strategy. The young lawman had seen how Callahan used the gang's own tactical doctrine against them, turning their strengths into fatal weaknesses. As evening approached, the tide had turned decisively. Black's forces, which had seemed on the verge of victory hours earlier, now found themselves fighting for survival. Their coordinated assault teams were isolated and cut off, their communication disrupted by the very smoke they had used to mask their advance. The gang's numerical advantage had become a liability in the confined spaces where they now fought. The true masterstroke of Callahan's strategy became apparent as Black attempted to withdraw his forces to regroup. The sheriff had anticipated this move, positioning his strongest units to cut off retreat routes. The gang's options narrowed with each passing minute, their tactical flexibility reduced to increasingly desperate choices. Emma Parker's cafe, now serving as both command center and aid station, buzzed with renewed purpose. The town's defenders moved with confident efficiency, understanding that their earlier setbacks had been part of a larger plan. Even those who had doubted during the crisis now saw the genius in Callahan's strategy. Marshal Harrison, watching the transformation from his position near the church, smiled despite his wound. "Hayes taught us all about the art of war," he mused to those nearby, but Marcus learned something more important, the art of victory. The marshal's words captured the essence of what was unfolding. Black had mastered tactics, but Callahan had transcended them, creating a strategy that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. As darkness approached, Shadow Creek stood poised for the final phase of Iron Hand's plan. The Black River Gang, which had arrived confident in their superior numbers and tactical sophistication, now faced the prospect of complete defeat. More importantly, they faced it at the hands of a man who had taken Hayes's teachings and evolved them into something more powerful, the ability to turn an entire community into a weapon of justice. As night descended on Shadow Creek, the culmination of Callahan's strategy forced Jackson Black into a position the gang leader had never anticipated. His forces were divided, cut off from support, and trapped in a series of deadly positions throughout the town. The sophisticated assault that had seemed destined for victory hours earlier had transformed into a tactical nightmare, engineered by the one man who truly understood Hayes's teachings. Marshal Harrison, observing from his position near the church, recognized the moment when Black finally understood the full scope of his predicament. The gang leader's increasingly desperate attempts to coordinate his scattered forces revealed a man coming to terms with complete tactical failure. More importantly, it showed someone realizing they had been outmaneuvered not just physically, but psychologically. "You can see it in his movements," Harrison explained to Deputy Reed as they watched Black's frantic signals to his remaining men. "He's finally understanding what Marcus learned years ago, that everything Hayes taught us was just the foundation. The real lessons come from moving beyond the doctrine." The marshal's words proved prophetic, as Black's next actions demonstrated both his desperation and his limitations. The gang leader attempted to rally his forces for one final, concentrated assault on what appeared to be the weakest point in the town's defense, the southeastern approach near Emma Parker's cafe. It was a textbook response, exactly what Hayes would have recommended in similar circumstances. It was also precisely what Callahan had been waiting for. Dr. Wheeler, treating wounded defenders nearby, witnessed the moment when Black's last gambit fell apart. The gang's assault met not the vulnerable position they expected, but a carefully prepared killing ground. Callahan had positioned his best marksmen in concealed locations, supported by townspeople who had trained for weeks for exactly this scenario. The resulting crossfire was devastating. Even then, Black showed why Hayes had considered him a premier student. He adapted quickly, trying to transform his failed assault into a fighting retreat. But each escape route he attempted had been anticipated and blocked. Every alternative he considered had already been countered. The gang leader found himself forced toward the town square where Iron Hand waited. The confrontation that followed would be retold in Shadow Creek for generations. Black, realizing the trap had closed completely, chose to face his fate with the cold professionalism Hayes had instilled in all his students. He emerged into the square alone, his gun belt hanging low, ready for the final test of everything he had learned. Sheriff Callahan stood waiting in the center of the square, his gloved hand resting near his peacemaker. The evening light caught the scars on his neck, physical reminders of the day Hayes's teaching had turned to betrayal. The two men faced each other across 30 feet of blood-soaked ground, each recognizing in the other the culmination of different paths taken from the same starting point. "You've learned a lot since Texas," Black called out, his voice carrying the weight of bitter recognition. The old man would be proud. Callahan's response was characteristic in its quiet certainty. "Hayes taught us how to kill. I learned something more important, how to protect." The gang leader's laugh held no humor. "Still the righteous one, aren't you, Marcus? Still thinking there's more to this than power and skill?" His hand hovered near his gun, testing the moment. "That's why Hayes chose me to finish you. He knew I understood what it's really about." "No," Callahan replied softly. "He chose you because you never learned to think beyond his teachings, never understood that true strength comes from standing with others, not over them." The sheriff's words carried the weight of years of reflection and hard-earned wisdom. "That's why you'll lose here, just like Hayes lost in Texas." The tension in the square built to breaking point as the two men measured each other. Black's reputation for speed and accuracy was well earned, his skill honed through years of violence. But Callahan had moved beyond mere gunfighting prowess, his abilities tempered by a deeper understanding of justice and protection. The moment of truth came with the suddenness of a lightning strike. Black's draw was a blur of motion, his technique flawless in its execution. But Callahan's response seemed to transcend human limitations, his peacemaker appearing in his hand with impossible speed. Two shots rang out almost as one, their echoes rolling across the square like thunder. Black's bullet passed through the space where Callahan had been a heartbeat earlier. The sheriff's shot struck with surgical precision, and the gang leader found himself staring at his own mortality with newfound understanding. As he fell, his final words carried both recognition and regret. "So that's what Hayes never taught us." The aftermath brought a profound quiet to Shadow Creek. The remaining gang members, seeing their leader fall, surrendered without further resistance. Marshal Harrison coordinated their detention while Dr. Wheeler tended to the last of the wounded. The town had survived, transformed by its trial into something stronger than before. Emma Parker, surveying the damage to her cafe, summed up the town's sentiment. "We're still standing because the sheriff taught us to stand together. That's something no gang can break." Her words captured the essential truth that had made their victory possible, the strength of unity over individual power. Deputy Reed found Callahan on his office porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. The badge was back on his chest, symbol not just of law, but of the choice to protect rather than dominate. The legend of Iron Hand had evolved into something greater, a testament to the power of justice, tempered by wisdom and community. The story of Shadow Creek's stand against the Black River Gang would be told and retold across the territories, growing with each telling. But those who had lived through it understood the deeper truth. They had witnessed not just a legendary gunfighter's last great battle, but the triumph of protection over power, of unity over force, of justice over mere violence. As night settled over Shadow Creek, the town began its recovery, stronger for having faced its trial together. And in his office, Sheriff Marcus "Iron Hand" Callahan allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing that Hayes's dark legacy had finally been answered not just with superior skill, but with a better way of living. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.